Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Conspiracy Farm, where we don't start the conspiracies, we just add the water. And now, your host of the most state-of-the-art, most informed podcast on the interweb, I present to you Pat Milankovitch and Jeffrey Wilson. Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready for war?
What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Greetings and salutations for another episode for the archives of the Conspiracy Farm. Jeffrey Wilson, rolling shotgun, as always, with UFC Hall of Famer, eater of worlds, master of the tango, lover of ice cream, Pat Milankovitch. What's up, champ?
I can only do left-handed cartwheels, though.
Yeah.
Can't go to the right. I can only go to the left. I don't know why that is.
You can't be the master of everything, brother. But today, man, I'm really stoked because this guy's literally been our most viewed episode. He's just I could listen to him for hours. Everybody's probably heard him and Graham Hancock for hours on the Joe Rogan Experience. He's an architect, geological theorist, anthropological theorist, master builder, architectural designer, teacher,
Hello?
Geometrician, geomythologist,
Hello?
geological explorer, and renegade scholar. I love
Hello?
that. Mr. Randall Carlson joining us once again. What's up, Randall?
Randall, Jeff's talking to you. Can you hear him?
Hey, you disappeared for a moment there.
Oh, well, how are we doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, but you sound
Fantastic.
like you're
I
in the
wanna give
bottom of
shout
a
out to
well,
the boys over at the
a very deep
America
well.
podcast, Graham and Darren, for help facilitate getting you back on. Check those guys out at grimerica.ca if you want to check out their volumes and volumes. A very, very interesting and thought-provoking podcast. And you guys have an event coming up, don't you guys, that you want to shout out there, Randall?
Yeah, I do. It's in May. May 17th, there's going to be a sort of gathering. The Grimerica boys have rented a lodge there in southern Colorado, just north of Pagosa Springs. And we're going to get together and do some good eating and some exploring. And we'll have some lectures and multimedia shows and who knows what. So it's going to be from the 17th, there's going to be, I think the way they've set it up is there's going to be three, I guess they're calling them trimesters, where you come in for 3 days, and we're going to do three of them back to back. So the best bet would be to go to the Grimerica website where they've got the details.
Okay. That sounds like a great time, man. I'd love to check that out.
Yeah, have you ever spent any time in southern Colorado in the Durango area or northern New Mexico, around Taos?
I've never been there. I've been all over the country, but I've never been there.
That's a wonderful place. It is. So we're going to be exploring. It's going to be kind of a combination of archaeology and geology in our field trips. We're going to be learning about the Chacoan culture that occupied the San Juan Basin of New Mexico and then extended up into southern Colorado and into Utah. And it's one of those mysterious lost cultures that built a lot of really cool infrastructure that's still out there in the deserts. It's archaeoastronomy is the term, because this is the science that looks at how these ancient peoples were building their sacred centers, their urban centers, their temples, and their complexes according to the astronomical patterns in the sky. So that's a big part of what we'll be doing, is learning about that and then exploring some of that. And then we'll be looking at some of the regional geology that has evidence for some major transitional events in Earth history, some of them quite recent, as a matter of fact. So there'll be it'll be in a kind of an eclectic mix, but mostly focused on the archaeology and the geology of the area.
And
there's plenty of that.
As far as those structures go, Randall, I was wondering, have mathematicians been put onto these locations to measure them and figure out exactly, how precisely they built these buildings to match the astronomical, the heavens above? Yes.
Mostly it's been astronomers. Archaeoastronomy has been kind of a subset of the whole. It's an interdisciplinary approach where you're looking at the archaeology, you're looking at the infrastructure and the buildings, the roadways, the causeways, the plazas, and all of this. And what it requires is kind of an overlap between understanding geometry, architecture, and astronomy. So it's a field that didn't exist, in the 50s and 60s, other than totally out on the fringes. But in the last 2 or 3 decades, it's kind of come into its own. So once it became, it became accepted that, these people were doing that. These people were obsessively interested in the sky, and for whatever was motivating them, they attempted to duplicate the patterns of the sky down here below. It's kind of the alchemical dictum, as above, so below, in the literal,
right.
most literal sense.
And what time period were these structures built, or this society built? Have they figured that out?
Yeah, I'm guessing. Well, it's probably more than a guess, but based upon the evidence I've seen, it probably began about 1000 BC and came in several waves, and the final wave was perhaps 800 years ago.
That recent, up to that recent, okay.
Up to that recent, assuming that the dating is correct. And at this point, I don't have any reason to doubt the dating. It appears like some of the sites were occupied, then abandoned, then occupied again. And somewhere around 700 to 800 years ago, apparently there was a very severe drought in the southwestern U.S. area.
Okay.
And this might have been the death knell for the Chacoan culture.
So they just simply moved out of the area, or did they die off, or?
Oh, that's part of the mystery. I'm going to lean towards they moved out of the area, but there was probably starvation as well, because when the rains disappeared, the crops failed, and when the crops failed, you don't eat.
Right.
And then the next thing that happens is famine. So,
yeah.
And then once people get weak from not having eaten, their immune systems get compromised, and then that's when pestilence and disease comes in. You can see that quite frequently throughout history, where there have been periods of famine, and that's been followed by, the bubonic plague, the Black Plague, the Justinian plague. All of those came in the wake of periods where people didn't have food. And mostly that was brought about by cold. The Little Ice Age caused, when that came on in the early 1300s, it caused crop failures all over Europe in the 1340s. And then as a result of that, because Europe had been quite prosperous for 3 or 4 centuries during the medieval warm period, and it was during this time when they had an abundance of food, and they could organize these armies of craftsmen to build these magnificent cathedrals that they built all over Europe. But when the climate shifted in the early 1300s, there was a whole series of crop failures that led to famine, and then you had the bubonic plague that wiped out,
right,
in some places as much as half the population. In some places, almost the entire population. And so suddenly there was no workforce, and people were thrown back, into the survival mode. So that was the end of, the Gothic building enterprise that had gone on for almost 200 years.
Amazing to destroy society that way. And, how quickly did the Ice Age come on at that time in the early 1300s?
Oh, pretty quick. Within about a decade or two at the most. I think there was a cold spell. I think it was in the year 1314. And then, it didn't come on all at once. What happened was you sort of saw this progressive deterioration of the climate over a period of several decades. Because there would have been some extremely cold winters, then some chilly, wet, damp summers, then some warmth came back again, and then it succumbed to the cold. So then you had about a century of what I call the first wave of the Little Ice Age. And this is when glaciers began to grow again. And by the 1600s and 1700s, the glaciers had grown throughout most of the world to a larger extent than they had been in over 10,000 years since the end of the Great Ice Age. And so a lot of, in Europe particularly, a lot of farms were destroyed as the glaciers increased in size, and they came down out of the mountain valleys into the what they call the intermontane or intermountain valleys where the farms were, and wiped out the farms.
That's incredible. Now, we hear scientists talking about a current ice age that's potentially coming now. How much truth is behind that? What's going on with the climate change and all the other talk that we've heard about for decades? We don't want to be controversial necessarily about this, but you're running in circles of people who are very intelligent, who are very educated about this stuff. What's actually going on? Do you believe?
Well, for about 3 years now, we have been in what's called the solar minimum, and the solar minimum is definitely correlated with climate change.
Right.
And without getting into the controversial stuff, I guess there's a great deal of evidence out there correlating climate change with solar change, solar variability, and it's regrettable that tends to be downplayed or ignored in most of the scenarios that are coming out of the IPCC, which basically was an organization that was founded to make the case that humans are the dominant cause of climate change. So given that, and I mean, anybody who doubts that can actually read that in the charter of the organization. It's stated right there. So reading that, you realize, okay, they're not going to be looking at the sun. They're not going to be looking at changes in the geomagnetic field. They're not going to be looking at changes in the amount of cosmic dust accreted to the Earth. They're not going to be looking at volcanism. They're not going to really be looking at changes in atmospheric and oceanic circulation as much as they're going to be looking at carbon dioxide, because of the fact that carbon dioxide is directly a function of modern civilization.
Right. Well, you can't tax the sun. You can't charge it extra money for a gallon of gasoline either.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That is exactly right. And I don't know if you remember this, but in the 70s, the concern was about an ice age, not global warming. The concern was about global cooling, and the reason for that is because you see there were old models of like climate change, particularly with reference to the glacial and interglacial ages that were, had been well established by the late 1800s, but the time frames were always considered to be extremely long. In other words, we might have 100 or 150,000 years to get into an ice age and just as long to get out of an ice age, right?
Right.
Well, so what changed that was in the 1950s was the development of radiocarbon dating as a method of dating organic material that's less than, say, 40 or 50,000 years old. And what had happened was the method of radiocarbon dating was developed in the early 50s, but it took a decade or two to build up a database of dates where one could look and go, okay, so we were assuming that the great ice sheets over North America were pretty much intact consistently for maybe 100,000 years or longer. Problem is that they began to do radiocarbon dating and discovered that, well, right in the middle of where the big ice sheet was, where it might have been 1.5 miles thick, there were forests growing, and those forests were growing there 35,000, 40,000 years ago. So clearly, if there were forests growing there couldn't have been 1 mile thick ice sheet.
Right.
So the question then becomes well, what was the extent of the ice sheet during this period? And it must have shrunk considerably from its most massive extent. And then the other thing is that realizing that most of the ice was still there at 14 or 15,000 years ago. And the assumption was, up to this time, is that the ice disappeared because there were changes in Earth's orbital geometry and the connection with the sun, right? So Earth, sometimes is a little farther away from the sun, sometimes it's a little closer.
Yeah.
The Earth is tilted. Sometimes the northern hemisphere is tilted more towards the sun, sometimes the southern hemisphere is.
Right.
And, of course, the northern hemisphere is mostly land, and the southern hemisphere is mostly ocean. So you have the potential of this great ice accumulation in the northern hemisphere more so than the southern hemisphere. But in any case, these forces of geometric change between the Earth and the sun are called Milankovitch forces or Milankovitch cycles, after Milutin Milankovitch, who was a mathematician. I think he was Serbian, that did the calculations. But within that model, it's a long, gradual process to get out of an ice age. Problem is now, as we know, that it was not even remotely close to a long gradual process. It was a episodic process. There was.
Are you talking a strike from something that came out of the heavens, so to speak?
Well, you know what? I would consider that to be one of the prime contenders for explaining the what we now know is that, you see, for example, when the ice melts, obviously that ice is melting and it's going back into the oceans. As it goes into the oceans level rise. So it's the opposite process. When the ice is growing, ocean levels are shrinking. So at the late glacial maximum, as it's called, which was 16 to 20,000 years ago, sea levels were as much as 400 feet lower than they are now.
Wow.
So the earlier assumption is that there was a relatively smooth process. The ice melted away and sea levels came up in a very gradual, very uniform manner. But that's not how it happened. The sea levels came up in pulses of huge pulses of meltwater introduced suddenly into the ocean. For example, meltwater pulse 1A, as it's called, is now dated around 14,600 years ago. There was another great pulse of meltwater dated to 11,600 years ago, and there's evidence that there may have been a third pulse around 12,800 years ago, which corresponds to the onset of the Younger Dryas. So what it appears is that there had to have been sudden energy inputs into the system because it takes energy to melt ice, right? So we're talking about an ice mass over North America that was bigger than the one that's now over the South Pole, Antarctica.
Wow.
Now, if you were going to try to come up with a scenario, hey, let's melt all the ice in Antarctica in a few thousand years, how would you do it? Well, the problem with that is that there's not enough energy available to accomplish that in a few thousand years, because it requires a significant input of heat to accomplish that melting. So what was the source of that heat? That's the mystery. Now, Robert Schoch believes it was the sun, and I tend to agree with him. But I also believe that we were dealing with what you just brought up was some impacts of objects from space, which certainly could introduce an enormous amount of energy into the system and trigger extreme melting.
And the argument about, they still are searching for major craters. I mean, they found some, obviously, but the fact that there was a couple miles of ice over the top of everything and a crater being formed wouldn't necessarily happen as easily, I guess, if that were the case, right?
That's exactly right, because the ice is going to absorb a lot of the energy of the impact. Now, of course, there's so many variables there that it's a complex thing to think about, but, you're talking about, obviously, first and foremost would be the size of the impactor. The second thing would be the velocity of the impactor. The third thing would be the density of the impactor and its composition. The fourth thing would be the angle of approach. All of these things are going to affect what happens in terms of the immediate post-impact phenomena and the resultant cratering effects. So if you had a mile and a half or more of ice, and the object was, say, only a half a mile or less in diameter, you're probably not going to have a typical bowl-like crater form under the ice. If it's a little bigger so that it can penetrate the ice, it most likely will blast a crater out. But the problem is now in the process of that impact, you've generated enough heat to melt an enormous amount of ice.
So sediment and everything else flows back in, probably?
Flows back in, that's exactly right.
Okay.
And in fact, there are very few analogs for impacts into ice sheets. So the things I have looked at primarily to try to get an understanding would be an impact into the ocean, right? Which is very distinct from an impact into land. Now, an impact into ocean, you'd aloft huge amounts of water vapor into the atmosphere. And that water vapor is a greenhouse gas. So it's going to form a canopy that causes temporary short-lived runaway global warming until the water vapor precipitates out. And the impact onto land is going to loft enormous amounts of dust into the atmosphere, and it's also going to trigger lots of wildfires as a secondary effect. And those wildfires will put more soot and carbon into the atmosphere. That will increase the opacity of the atmosphere, reflecting a lot more sun back into space, and therefore cause global cooling. So there are those two different effects. Now, what happens, though, if you have a multiple impact event and you have impacts into both ocean and land? Well, now you're going to get such a complex set of effects that it's going to be difficult to sort them out. But that, I think, is the challenge in front of us, because the evidence is there that there was some kind of an impact from something from space. Right. I mean, the iridium is there, the platinum is there, the nanodiamonds, the microspherules, the magnetic grains. All of these things taken together really point pretty much directly to an impact of some kind, right?
Now, in Australia, there's, correct me if I'm wrong, but is there a debris field of meteor material where there is not necessarily a crater?
Yes. In fact,
which would suggest hitting a massive layer of ice, right?
Yeah. Now that's probably from low-density objects entering the atmosphere and exploding in the atmosphere.
Okay.
See, which is essentially what happened in 1908 with the Tunguska cosmic event over Siberia, which you're probably familiar with, right?
Yes.
The big explosion there that
leveled trees for hundreds of miles.
Yeah, leveled trees over 800 and some square miles. Incinerated about 100 or 150 square miles right under the epicenter of the blast that just turned it into nothing.
How far above the Earth did it detonate?
About 5 miles, 8 kilometers, roughly. So, yeah, and that was based on the size and the density of the object. It was probably, I think the prime candidate for its identity was a member of the Torrid meteor stream, which the Earth crosses twice each year, once right around Halloween and again in late June, early July. It's a stream of meteoritic debris that is circling. It is handed off between Jupiter and the Sun, so it's in a big elliptical orbit that takes it out to Jupiter and then back in where it goes around the Sun. So Earth crosses that stream as it's coming in towards the Sun in late October, early November.
Okay.
It crosses the stream again when it's coming from around the Sun in late June, early July. So now from the detailed analysis of the eyewitness accounts, the astronomers and others who have been looking at this were able to determine the point in the sky from which the object actually emanated. And one of the things that was repeatedly said by people was things like, well, it looked like it was shot out of the sun. It looked like it was born from the sun. Things like that, which, puts it coming into the atmosphere from the direction of the sun. And it was early in the morning, about maybe 7:30 on June 30th by the Gregorian calendar, that thing came in and exploded, but it came in essentially without warning. They couldn't see it. Again, because it was coming from the direction of the sun, which is exactly where a Torrid meteor would be coming from.
So this is amazing, though. So if it was born of the sun, it would be a solar flare of epic proportions. Then,
if it was born, but see, what I think that was the illusion, that because it came directly from that direction.
Okay.
What I'm saying?
Yeah.
So if you were looking in the sky where the thing was coming from, it was coming from the direction of the sun.
All right.
And this is why we don't see Torrid meteors really. We don't see the summertime Torrids because of that fact that in order to see them, you have to look directly towards the sun, essentially. Whereas the fall-time Torrids, you're looking out towards the constellation of Taurus, the bull. That's why they're called the Torrids.
Right.
And so to see the Torrids, go out in late October, early November. And actually the radiant point, which is the point at which a meteor stream appears to emanate from space, which is an illusion because it's not really coming from Taurus, right? It's just that we look in the direction of Taurus to see those meteors coming back in from out in the Jupiter's orbit, right?
Okay.
But the radiant point, which is like the bullseye, imagine this that you're you walk down railroad tracks as a kid, right? And you remember how the parallel tracks converge to a point in the distance?
Yes, sir.
Now picture, instead of two-dimensional railroad tracks, you've got like a tunnel. And that's the best way to visualize a meteor stream, is that you've got this stream of debris. It's coming in a tunnel. And so as you're looking up the tunnel, it's going to give the illusion of perspective. It's going to look like everything is converging on a point. It's not really, because these objects are all flying in parallel paths.
And they're all orbiting also, correct? Or are they not?
Yes, they're orbiting.
Yes.
And the thing is, though, the orbit is big enough that by the time it intersects the Earth's orbit, for all practical purposes, those pieces are flying in parallel lines.
Okay.
You see?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever had a calculus course at any time in your life, but
yes.
The idea of
I got hit a lot since then, though. I've been hit a lot.
Yeah, that's true. I guess so. So all that calculus stuff kind of got left there in the ring, didn't
It's
it?
2 + 2 now, buddy.
Okay. Well, hey, that's better than some people.
Right. So let me ask you, I mean, if we were to have one of these events now with 7-8 billion people on this planet, one that, caused massive flooding, I mean, what are we looking at as far as costs to human lives or just human existence?
Well, it depends on the magnitude of the event. Now, a Tunguska
sure, but one
scale
that's happened before, say, for instance.
Let's start with the Tunguska event. The Tunguska event, the energy release was about equivalent to a 15 megaton hydrogen bomb. Now, a 15 megaton hydrogen bomb is generally considered to be a city buster. It could, one hydrogen bomb of 15 megatons could wipe out any urban area on Earth.
LA's gone.
LA is gone, yes. LA is gone. So 15 megatons is 15 million tons of TNT equivalent, right?
Yeah.
So the Hiroshima object was 10,000 tons. So a 1,500 megaton bomb, hydrogen bomb, would be the equivalent of 1,500 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. So that's pretty damn devastating.
That's terrifying.
Okay? Now, when we're talking about a Tunguska object, we're looking at an object that's estimated to be somewhere between 100 and 200 feet in diameter.
Tiny in the spectrum of things.
Yes, in the cosmic spectrum, it's a piece of cosmic dust,
right.
Basically. Now, if you get up to something much, much bigger than that, say 6 miles in diameter, which is the estimated diameter of the dinosaur-killing asteroid, we would be lucky to survive as a species, right?
Right.
We probably could if we had enough lead time, especially if we had like a lunar base that we could relocate to for a few years.
A lunar base. Wow.
Yeah.
That's mind-blowing.
Yeah. But that's not likely. What's more likely is something along the scale of a Tunguska object. But that in itself would be a pretty dramatic event, because we're talking about, imagine, like Hurricane Katrina hitting New Orleans. That was a big deal, right?
Correct.
But now take that, multiply that times 10, say raised by an order of magnitude. That's kind of where the scale we'd be looking at with a Tunguska scale event. If it happened over a fairly densely populated part of the Earth, like the Eastern Seaboard or Europe or any place like that, so are you still there?
Oh yeah, I'm here. I'm
Okay.
just soaking it all in.
Weird noises came across just then. Anyways, so you would have, but see, here's where it gets interesting and kind of scary. There's a number of astronomers and astrophysicists and stuff who are studying the various kinds of impacts and encounters that the Earth can have. And one of the things that they concluded was there may be episodes where there are multiple Tunguska events, and not just a single object coming in, but perhaps dozens or maybe even hundreds.
Which is certainly believable considering all the debris out there, and
yes.
So.
And here's the thing: you have a few dozen of those. that's going to be a major game changer. You have a few hundred of them. That you're talking about something that's going to be on the scale of an all-out thermonuclear war in terms of its devastation.
It's an extinction-level event at that point.
Well, it may not. I wouldn't call it extinction from this. Locally, yes, it would certainly cause extinction of species locally. It would definitely cause the extinction of civilization, not necessarily the extinction of the human species, but essentially we would find ourselves living back a Stone Age existence, starting all over again.
No more iPads for Junior.
No more iPads for Junior. No.
Well, I'd like to shift gear with you a little bit because, I mean, I'd love to stay on this path, but there's so much stuff that you know that I want to hit on. I want to talk a little bit about, and this is me trying to give you props. When you were on Rogan's show with Graham Hancock and Michael Shermer, Graham Hancock, obviously, and you know, your beliefs coincide, your research coincides for the most part, obviously. But Shermer's a mainstream guy that just, it seemed like he was very uncomfortable during that show. He was trying to stick up for mainstream, the old school, you know, what we learned in elementary, junior high, and high school and college, the old books, the old ways of thinking, and a lot of old science. And he and Graham Hancock had pretty heated, I don't think they liked each other a whole lot, let's put it that way. And you seemed to be the one, you didn't talk that much, but when you did, you said a lot, and you circled it all back in and made it understandable for the layman to really be able to decipher a lot of this. And Rogan was on your side quite a bit also.
Yeah, I think, you know, he saw what was going on, and you know, Shermer plays a role, and it's a valuable role. There needs to be skeptics on all levels, but
sure.
Basically Michael Shermer, his job, he's a gatekeeper. So his job is to undermine anything that would question the prevailing paradigms, you see.
Right.
So that's what he's doing. And, you know, I came away from it with the conviction that, yeah, he didn't really know what he was talking about. And he came unprepared. You know, afterwards we hung out a bit, you know, and it was very congenial. There was no, you know, Graham and Michael Shermer got on famously for about an hour while we hung out, and then we parted company and said, hey, we should do this again. But I don't think Michael really wants to. And, you know, the thing was, is I tell you, Pat, I went there prepared to unleash the big guns, and I never really did. I was sitting there with, you know, hundreds of slides ready to jump in there and, you know.
Yeah, and I don't think you needed to. I think just the little bits that you needed to insert yourself in the conversation was more than enough, more than ample to really take his legs out from underneath him on a lot of the stuff that he was trying to say.
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, I listen, to me, it's like I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of a lot of things that I hear, and I think there is a lot of nonsense out there. And, you know, I try to dot my I's and cross my T's and do my homework so that I'm not coming in and just coming with something half-baked, but it's something that I've actually thought about and done the research and done the background on it so I can actually speak knowledgeably, cite the resources, you know the references, know who's doing the work and what it is, and I try to look at both sides of it too, you know. So, like in terms of the Younger Dryas impact ideas, I've gone through not only the proponents but the opponents of the idea, line by line, you know, to try to see what are the criticisms of this. And the critics of the theory do have some legitimate arguments, right? But when it comes down to it, they don't have an alternate explanation. They've got some legitimate criticisms of the impact scenario at the end of the last ice age, but then they don't have an explanation for how you could trigger such an extreme change in the global environment over such a short period of time.
Right. It's like people that criticize certain politics and don't offer up a solution. It's the same mentality, just people complaining, basically. And so, you know, when this is something that's been really sticking with me a lot because of all I'm kind of changing gears a little bit as far as ancient civilizations, a lot of the pyramids globally that have been found all over and are being discovered constantly in the jungles down in South America. And I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are in terms of the burial grounds, the Indian mounds here in, say, the Midwest in the United States, just for instance. Are those pyramidic structures? Are those structures that are similar to what have been found in the ancient Mayan civilizations, things like that?
Yeah.
Are they very similar? Are they the same thing?
They're very similar.
Okay.
A lot of the differences, of course, has to do with what's available to build with. In the Mississippi and Ohio valleys, you had earth and timber. In Central America, you had limestone primarily.
Right.
But when you look at the general form of the structures, very similar, because you have truncated pyramids in both places. The difference being that, say, in Mesoamerica, the pyramids, the flat-top pyramids, are built of stone, whereas in North America they're built of earth. But in the North American pyramids, they all held wooden timber-framed structures on top of them that were undoubtedly temples. That are, of course, because they were timber, they're now gone.
Okay.
But in some of them, if you look carefully, you can see that depressions in the ground that were where the holes were that held the posts.
Interesting. So, who were the builders of these? How far back do these date? The oldest ones, and who were the builders of them?
Well, the oldest ones, and now Graham is getting into this in his new book that's going to be coming out in April. The oldest ones are 5,000 years old. There are monumental earthwork structures in Louisiana that are actually older than 5,000 years.
Wow.
Poverty Point, Watson Break are two of them. Let's see, Poverty Point, I think, has been dated at 4,700 years, and Watson Break has been dated around maybe 5,500 years. So, and, basically what you see is when you start looking at these structures, and whether it's South America, and in Graham's book, he gets into great detail about the earthwork architecture in the Amazonian basin. And the interesting thing there is that stuff and the vast extent of this infrastructure has been hidden by the rainforests for centuries.
Yeah.
And with all the clear cutting that's been going on, which, is not a good thing because, of course, it's releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But what it's doing, though, is it's exposing the land below, and there's this gigantic, extensive infrastructure of monumental earthwork architecture, and it's, for all practical purposes, it's almost identical to what we find in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys.
And what type of numbers are we talking in terms of population of these cities?
Oh, tens of thousands of people. So the whole population had to have been at least several million.
That's incredible.
It is incredible, and I would highly recommend, when it comes out in April, to get Graham's book and read it, because it's going to be a paradigm changer. I'm about 2/3 of it right now. I'm doing a review for him. He sent me a pre-publication copy, and I've been, like I said, about 2/3 of the way through it, and it's gonna change the terms of the argument.
Able to get by,
and
which
he addresses a lot of the things people have brought up. The critics that don't like the idea that history may be a lot more complicated than the standard textbook versions.
Yeah. So the information that we got, that we grew up reading, all the history books and everything else, was this by design, or was this just simply by accident? Just people just didn't know, they didn't have the technology. We hadn't found the pyramids. All this other stuff that's that I could theorize on. But what do you think really is the cause of the misinformation we were fed?
I would be inclined towards the second. I would be less inclined to think that it was conspiracy in the old days. I just think it was part of the model, sort of this Judeo-Christian model of earth change, and then how that transitioned into sort of the modern concepts of global change and prehistory. For one thing, there was an objection. There was sort of what we say type of a cultural chauvinism going on, not to give credit to various indigenous peoples around the planet that may have actually had a much more sophisticated understanding of astronomy and geometry and mathematics and engineering than they've been given credit for. But it certainly does seem now like there is sort of a conspiratorial element to it, because what seems to be emerging out of the evidence of history and prehistory is that, there have probably been multiple civilizations that have arisen and become lost in the vagaries of time and have left almost no trace. Because the human presence on Earth keeps getting pushed further and further back. I mean, we're finding now evidence of modern humans going back to 150 to 200,000 years.
That's the thing that is blowing everybody's minds, and a lot of the people that are protecting, the old textbook way of thinking are freaking out about that.
Well, yeah, and they don't, because it's going to require basically. Here's what we're looking at: with the models of historical change and geological change and so forth have evolved over 100 to 150 years, right? Most of the 20th century was the development of the academic models of prehistory, the ideas of long, slow, gradual change. You have the uniformitarian concept in geology, which is one grain of sand, one drop of water at a time. If you've got millions and millions of years, that's going to accomplish, and be able to shape the world into what we see today, right? And alongside of that came Darwinian evolution, which is kind of the biological counterpart to geological uniformity, which says, that species evolve one small incremental change at a time, and over long periods of time, these changes accumulate, and eventually one species becomes a new species. But, we're still back to the problem that, when we look at species, we're looking at the end members of a continuum, but where the hell is the continuum, you see? Where is it, right? But then, and this is why in the early 80s, there was such resistance to the idea that the dinosaurs were exterminated by an asteroid impact, because suddenly you've got a mass extinction event. You've got a mass mortality event that wipes out a majority of the species existent at the time, right?
Yeah.
And then that's followed by a hiatus in the fossil record where there is an extreme impoverishment of diversity in the species. And then suddenly all these new species appear. They call it the zoologists and the paleontologists and things looking at this will call it a rapid speciation event. But what causes that? No one really knows at this point. But so now the models of evolutionary change are going to have to take account of these rapid extinctions and these rapid speciation events and figure out how do those go? How do those get worked into the model? I think part of it is this. I think part of it is that when you have a mass extinction event that's triggered by some type of a cosmic encounter, an asteroid or a comet delivers all kinds of very exotic materials into Earth's biosphere during an impact event. And a lot of the research that I'm really interested in right now has to do with how those materials, such as the platinum group metals in particular, might act as catalysts to trigger rapid evolutionary change over a very short period of time. It's very possible, Pat, that the same event that wipes out a whole bunch of species on one end is then stimulating or catalyzing the emergence of a bunch of new species. In fact, since
a cosmic Noah's Ark.
Pardon me?
A cosmic Noah's Ark.
A cosmic Noah's Ark. And as cliche as it might sound, I don't rule out the possibility that peoples back during the last mass extinction episode, which was the Younger Dryas extinction episode, may...
Yeah, how many years ago was that? 30,000?
No, the Younger Dryas was about between 12,800 and 12,900 years ago.
Yeah.
And, this is the thing that Graham has been arguing, is that we now know, like from places like Gunung Padang and Göbekli Tepe and probably the Sphinx, or almost certainly the Sphinx, there was a much higher level of cultural activity going on back then than has been realized. And
not only so, the civilizations weren't only wiped out, but the intelligence went along with them, and it was like a starting over completely for the human race.
Like a computer crash and then a rebooting.
It's bizarre to think about. And, for me, I sit there and I ponder all of these megalithic structures that were built all over the planet. They coincide, the old star maps that are carved into stone everywhere with the same carvings all over the entire globe with all of the civilizations that existed. And I have to sit there and think, is it possible that we had some sort of, alien assistance in building these megalithic structures, or the knowledge that came with it?
Well, that's, a question that's been raised and debated and discussed for decades now. And I'll give you a little insight into what I think.
Okay.
I'm wide open on the question of aliens. I don't necessarily believe it. I don't necessarily disbelieve it.
Right.
The day that, the UFO, sets down and an alien gets out of it and I get to ask him a few questions, in fact, probably a lot of questions I've got,
yeah.
I'm going to, I'm holding back my opinion on the matter. But
right.
I think what we need to do is we just use the analogy of modern times. Like, remember when Shoemaker Levy 9 in 1994 struck Jupiter?
Right.
Right? Okay, so we were able to predict that 15 months in advance, or 12 months in advance. It was discovered in March of 93, and after 3 months of observation, the astronomers were able to predict that it was these 21 pieces of what had been a single cometary nucleus until it got ripped apart by Jupiter's intense gravity field, forming it into 21 separate pieces. They were able to predict that, in around the second week of July the following year, these pieces were going to collide with Jupiter. Now, let's suppose, Pat, that we discover an object and we realize whether or how we fare in the aftermath of an impact totally depends on how much time we have to prepare.
Right.
Now, so the thing is with Shoemaker Levy 9, it had undoubtedly been circulating the sun for centuries. We had just never discovered it, right? But it was out there, going like ping pong back and forth between the sun and Jupiter, right? Now, suppose we discover something. Astronomers are looking out there and they discover there's an asteroid and they start charting its orbital elements and they conclude that, you know what, in a decade or 5 years or 20 or whatever it might be, that darn thing is going to collide with the Earth. What would we do? Well, there's a number of things we could do, but every one of them would be oriented around maximizing the probabilities of our survival and maximizing our ability to preserve as much of our civilization and our science and our knowledge and learning as possible, see? So then what we would do is we would begin to devise strategies for perpetuating such a thing. Now, I think that if we look back, and I'm going to just put this out as a hypothetical model. If we look back at ancient history, we almost see that there's almost like two cultural trends running parallel. On the one hand, you see people that are living a very brutish Stone Age existence, what we might think of as barbarian existence, right? Hunter-gatherers, subsistence architecture. But then superimposed on that is just all of those things you were just talking about. This worldwide phenomena of megalithic architecture and monumental earthwork architecture and this archaeoastronomy.
Precise craftsmanship that would have required an enormous amount of organizational effort. And massive math skills.
And math, yes, exactly. Cartography, mathematics, engineering, astronomy,
right.
Even geology. There seems to be a source of knowledge that's out of context with the conventional models of prehistory. So think about this. Suppose we got faced with a devastating catastrophe that basically pulled the plug on civilization.
Yeah.
And in the aftermath of that, there might be two categories of survivors. Those who knew it was coming and went to great lengths to prepare and to preserve as much as they could. They survived because they intended to survive. They planned to survive. They prepared to survive. Then you have other survivors who just essentially survived because they happened to be in the right place at the right time. they got through the luck of the draw. They survived. Wherever they were, they didn't get wiped away by floods. They didn't get wiped out by the fires or the explosive events. Those people now are going to be thrown back into the Stone Age existence. And there's evidence now that in the aftermath of the Younger Dryas, there was a pretty extreme population collapse worldwide. That probably was the counterpart to the mass extinction of the great megafauna. In other words, we lost the woolly mammoth, we lost the saber-toothed cats, we lost the giant ground sloths, the Irish elk, the cave bear, on and on and on, right? Over 100 species. Well, those animals died in a catastrophe. To me, there's no doubt. The way when we examine the fossilized evidence, it's not consistent with human hunting. It's consistent with being wiped out in catastrophic events. So it's also now becoming more acceptable to consider that, well, maybe the human population went through a precipitous decline as well, right? So the survivors who survived because of the luck of the draw, their whole preoccupation is going to be just the day-to-day existence. Where are we going to get food to survive tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you had somebody else that actually went to great lengths to prepare and survive, just like, we see an analog here, particularly when we go back to the Cold War. We had, what they call the continuity of government, which the idea was in the aftermath of a Cold War, everything would be basically, in the aftermath of a nuclear war, civilization might succumb. But they had their strongholds, the Cheyenne Mountain in Wyoming, where they were going to take refuge in order to survive.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's the thing that I think about is, you talk about, there was a certain sector of society who prepared for this sort of stuff. They were educated enough, they prepared, and they survived. I look at it, it's the exact same thing now. If there's a massive meteor or anything headed towards Earth, I very much doubt that they're going to announce it on the nightly news that next Wednesday Earth is going to get destroyed. They're just not going to say it. I just don't see them saying it because the government and the people that run everything are going to be underneath those mountains because we know that we have those facilities. So it's the same thing today in my mind.
Oh, I think you're right. The thing is, though, it may not work so well because of the fact that there's too many amateur astronomers out there, and a lot of the professional astronomers, they're focused on, other galaxies, deep space objects and stuff. To discover an Earth-impacting asteroid or comet, you've got to be looking in near-Earth space. And you don't need, a $500 million telescope to do that. You can just do that from your backyard. And so just like Shoemaker-Levy 9, it's called Shoemaker-Levy because it was actually discovered by David Levy, who was an amateur astronomer, see?
Right.
So,
so you think the word would leak out that way?
I think the word would leak out that way. But and again, it depends on the lead time. If you've got 5 years, hey, a lot of people could get ready. If you've got 5 months, not so much.
Right. So the people that I'm going to go back to the builders of the structures here in North America. Okay. We don't have you for much longer, so I want to get to this. At 5,500 years, dating the oldest one that they found so far. Who built those? Are we talking who we would envision as the Native Americans who are, in our history books, or was it another civilization?
Okay, I tend to think that it was the Native Americans.
Okay.
I think that it was the indigenous peoples. I think let me put it this way, I think they provided the labor pool, but not necessarily the architectural design.
Very interesting. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all these mysteries and talk of giants that roamed the earth and all this sort of stuff. Is there any proof of that?
Well, I can't say there's proof, but there is a very strong circumstantial case. In a lot of the mound excavations of North America, there were, particularly in the 19th century, there were numerous giants. Now, I'm saying giants, I'm talking about 7 to 8 feet tall.
Right.
That tended to get lost. Now, I have in my collection, I have access to Emory University here where I live, and they have an extraordinary collection of documents, historical documents, and all of that. Been going through. Oh God, this has been years ago now, but going through a lot of the old stuff from the 19th century. Like archives of the various states and stuff, and there will be accounts of the excavation of various mound structures and so forth, and there are frequently accounts, Reverend so-and-so and his people are out there excavating and they discover an 8-foot skeleton. So, this was in the days there was, no internet for people to post things to go viral.
Right.
There was nothing really to be gained by coming out and proclaiming that you had found a giant.
And at what time frame would these people have been dated, these giants?
Well, I'm thinking we've got to go back several thousand years for that. Yeah, I would think so. So they were. Would you say that they were a subset or part of the Native Americans, or they were just a different group altogether? I think they would have been a different group altogether.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they probably met their demise at the hands of the Native Americans, maybe? Or the flood?
Maybe. Although I'm inclined to think that they probably died under as a result of natural catastrophes. Okay.
That's what I was wondering. I mean, that makes sense to me. The Great Flood, and there's nowhere to go.
Like here I'm just pulling something up here. This is from the annual report of the Smithsonian Institution entitled Antiquities of Kansas City, Missouri, dated 1877. We have lately made a discovery here of a number of Indian mounds which are evidently of great antiquity. They are situated on the north side of the Missouri River in the angle of the Great Bend upon the high bluffs commanding a view of the country about the mouth of the Kansas River directly opposite. We have not yet made any extended investigation of these mounds, but examined partially one group of 5. In the center of number 1, at a depth of about 5 feet, we found a human skeleton. The bones were so fragile that we could only get them out in fragments. We did not notice any very marked peculiarity to these bones except their great size and thickness.
Wow.
And, there's many. Yes, let's see. And here they, in another case, this was the 12th annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology from 1890. They excavated a mound and they found a sepulcher, and it was 8 feet long, and the skeleton that was in it pretty much filled up the whole sepulcher that they found and excavated from this mound.
Okay. So do you think this is the reason that because there was excavation going on in the 1800s, early 1900s, is this the reason the laws were passed to stop digging this stuff up, because it brought up potentially a different history than we were taught?
Maybe. I puzzled over that. Clearly, the idea that there may have been 7 and 8 foot people wandering about. Hey, here's the thing. We know we talk about megafauna, right?
Yeah.
Meaning huge or large or great fauna. And when we look at some of those, you talk about the Irish elk. It had an antler span of up to 12 feet. You look at the giant short-faced bear, Arctodus simus.
Massive.
Here was a creature that stood 6 to 7 feet tall at its shoulder and was twice the size of a modern grizzly bear.
Right.
And you could go on and on with this. The Mammothus imperator, or imperial mammoth, stood up to 16 feet high at its shoulder. It was twice as big as a modern elephant.
And so you think, the way it was put to me by a person, that runs in your circles is, animals were a lot bigger then. Why wouldn't the people have been bigger?
Why couldn't there have been?
Right.
Exactly.
So it does make perfect sense.
Yeah, it does. Here's another question. Historical Collections of Ohio in 2 volumes, an encyclopedia of the state, was published in 1888, but it was a collection of things that went back to the 1700s. So when the settlers first arrived in this one particular settlement along the Ohio River, there were 20 or 30 Indian cabins. There were mounds situated in the eastern part of the village, and an extensive burying ground near the Presbyterian church which appear to have had no connection with the burying places of the Indians. So when they excavated, among the human bones found in the mounds were some belonging to men of gigantic stature. Some of the skulls were of sufficient capacity to admit the head of an ordinary man, and jawbones that might have been fitted on over the face with equal facility. The other bones were proportionately large. Now imagine a skull that's big enough that you can put it on like a helmet.
That's a big person.
That's probably somebody who's 9 feet tall.
Yeah.
You know, so, I mean, and so the archives are full of this kind of stuff, Pat. And so what are you to make of it?
Well, and for anybody that doubts it, all you have to do is spend some time around some Samoans, and you'll realize it's not that unthinkable.
Samoans, okay. Why the Samoans now? I don't know.
I'm just saying because they're massive. If you've ever stood in a group of giant Samoan men, their heads are literally as big as my torso. They are massive human beings, and these people were even much bigger than them.
Yeah, apparently so.
So it's mind blowing. But well, sir, we have to let you go here pretty soon. You have been a treat to have on. It's always an education just to read, just to listen to you. I listen to you on a lot of different shows. And do you have any social media that people can follow you on, get more educated on, some books?
Well, yeah.
Anything,
I would say,
please.
I'm 90,000 words into my book. I'm going to try to have it finished by this summer.
Right.
And it's going to touch on a lot of the stuff we're talking about, with all the references and sources, so people can, follow this stuff up for themselves if they're so inclined. But, geocosmicrex.com, just like it sounds, geocosmicrex.com, and sacredgeometryinternational.com.
Anybody out there listening, and also any social media that people can follow you on, sir?
I haven't been too active on social media lately. I'm trying to get back to that, but I've been so busy with my design work and my research work. I find that I'm one of those. I tend to get on social media, and then 2 hours later, I'm going, wait a second, I don't have time for this.
I perfectly understand. I do understand, sir. Well, we want to thank you again, Randall Carlson, for coming on, and we've got to have you on again here. We apologize. Some technical difficulties. Jeffrey is furious he wasn't able to ask you some questions. Somehow he got dropped from the call, and we tried getting him back, but we're not able to. But we look forward to seeing your event again, May 17th.
May 17th in southern Colorado. And go to the Grimerica website to find out more.
Those guys are awesome. The Grimerica boys are awesome. So, check out the Grimerica site, and hopefully everybody can join Randall and the posse down there around Durango. It would be an amazing experience. I'm hoping I don't have to do a broadcast at that time, sir.
Yeah, there might be a possibility that you'd come hang with us for a day or two or three or whatever.
I certainly am hoping so. I know that I'm in Colorado at the beginning of May for a broadcast. I haven't seen my schedule any further out than that, so I don't know if I'm doing a broadcast on that weekend, but if I am not, you know where I'll be.
I do, man. Well, it'd be great to hang out with you and, meet you and get to know you better, and maybe that'll happen one day anyway.
It will. Thank you, sir. Randall Carlson, ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of The Conspiracy Farm.